All right, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's product training with Blue Triangle. So today we're going to talk about the Blue Triangle API, and we're going to focus on the JavaScript error endpoint. Now, if you're totally new to our API, don't worry, because we'll be going over the basics here in the beginning before we dive into the error endpoint. So this session is designed to introduce the Blue Triangle API to a new user, as well as offer insight for existing and more advanced users into how to create API requests for this error data. We call it the JavaScript error endpoint, but it really contains all kinds of errors, including things like XHR errors and CSP violations. All right, so my name is Mark, and I'm the support manager here at Blue Triangle, and I do these trainings each week about various topics related to web performance, analytics, and ultimately how to use Blue Triangle to solve problems. So let's go ahead and get started. As far as the agenda today, we're going to start with a recap of previous sessions we've done on the API. We'll give you an overview of the current endpoints for those of you who are totally new to the Blue Triangle API. We'll talk about how to connect to the API, finding your API key, and then we'll show you just an example request, what one of those looks like with Postman. Postman is an API testing tool. It's a common tool around the Blue Triangle offices. It's really easy to use, and then next we'll dive into the error endpoint. This is going to be where we'll focus today's training. And we'll talk about what are the required and optional parameters for the API request. And by the way, everything is going to be in JSON format, as you'll soon learn. And then after that, we'll talk about what kinds of things you can group by and additional options and filtering. And then finally, we're going to talk about some examples, some kind of real-world applications of using the API to answer questions like how many errors are happening by device, desktop, mobile, and tablet, which pages on my site are producing the most errors, and what's the most common error. So we'll walk through how to build the API request JSON for answering each of those questions. And then finally, we'll end with some Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those for you, and we'll definitely save a few minutes toward the end for that. All right, so quick recap. This is a list of all of our current API endpoints. There's 5 here, and we have a 6th one on the way. The 6th one is the revenue opportunity endpoint. I'll be doing a training on that for you guys in maybe a month or so, probably after the holidays in January 2021. So the performance resource and error endpoints, we've done a training on the performance and the resource endpoints, and today we're going to be talking about the error endpoint. Now the top 3 here are really all about real user and synthetic data. So the performance endpoint, this contains page level performance data, as well as business metrics like revenue and conversion rate and orders. The resource endpoint, this is the what we call WCD data, or resource level data. This is performance timings for individual files and domains loading on your site. Now the error endpoint, this contains JavaScript error data. It also contains general errors like XHR and fetch errors, as well as things like CSP violations. And some of the things you'll get with that are the time of the error message, the line number, and things like that. The site event markers, now we're kind of shifting gears here. This is more of a configuration as well as the content security policy endpoint. The site event marker endpoint, basically site event markers are annotations that display on your graphs. They are lines that mark significant events like browser updates or deployments that you've made. And this API endpoint helps you to automate the creation of these things. If you have deployment schedule or any sort of updates to your site, maybe sales or anything like that, you can mark with these event markers, and the API helps you easily manage that. And finally, the CSP endpoint, this lets you pull your currently configured content security policies. Pretty straightforward. And like I mentioned, the revenue opportunity endpoint, that's very new, and I'll be doing a training on that for you guys in a few weeks. All right, so real quick, how to access the API documentation. If you're in the Blue Triangle portal, you can just click the question mark icon and go to the Help Center. And in the documentation section, you'll see a subsection for API documentation. And each of the endpoints will have its own article, and all the information you'll need is going to be in there. All right, so how do you connect to the API? You can do it in a variety of ways. You can do it programmatically with Python, or you can use something like curl. For this example, we're going to use Postman. Like I mentioned before, it's just a great tool, really easy to use and straightforward for running HTTP requests. So to connect to the API, there's two main headers you're going to need to set. The first is your email, that's X API email, and your API key, and that's X API key here. And I'll show you how to get your API key in just a second. Another important note, these email addresses and API keys are case sensitive, so be careful doing any copying, pasting, make sure they're exactly the same. Requests to the API are generally post for the performance, resource, and error endpoints. For the others, site event markers and the content security policy, there will be some GET requests there as well. So how to find your API key is pretty straightforward. If you go into your profile in Blue Triangle, you click the little profile icon and view your profile. One of the data fields here is going to be your API key. So what does an example request look like? Well, here's what it looks like in Postman. Now, once you've connected to the API for the first time, you've got your headers properly set. The only thing that's going to need to change is this JSON, and that's really what we're going to spend the majority of our training today on, is how to formulate this JSON to get the response that we'd like. Now, if you're using Postman, up here you can choose the request method. In this example, we're doing a request to api.bluetriangletech.com/performance. The error endpoint is going to be /error. Now we've got our headers set over here on this tab. In the body, we're going to be using JSON, as I mentioned. So just choose this raw option, and over here in the right drop down, select the JSON format. When you do that, it's going to automatically add the content type header for application JSON, which is also going to be required. So you're going to send a request JSON, and you're also going to be getting a JSON formatted response. The response is pretty straightforward to parse. The first level here has some high level metadata, the site and how many items are in the response data. And really the key thing here is going to be the data array is going to have all of the information that you requested. All right, so let's talk about the error endpoint. What are the required parameters? So very similar to the performance and resource endpoints, we're going to build a little demo request here with just the required parameters. So based on the documentation, that is site, start end, and data columns. And I'm going to quickly go through what each of these are here right now. So the site parameter tells the API which site to pull the data from. This is unique to each site. If you have multiple sites in your account, this will be different for each one. You can find this site, we call it the site prefix because it's the host name in the btt.js to insert the rum JavaScript tag onto your site. So if you don't have that, you can also just find this in the sites page of the portal. If you don't have access to that, you can just reach out to us or the admin in your account, and they should be able to get that for you. So that's the site parameter. It's also going to be what shows up here in the drop down in the top left in blue triangle, the blue triangle portal. All right. The next thing is the start and end parameters. You can think of this as the time period, which I'm sure if you've used the blue triangle portal before, you're very familiar with the date picker here. So you're going to specify your start and end times and epoch, and you can put those in quotes or not. The API is relatively flexible with that. And it's going to be in epoch seconds. Also, a quick side note, epochconverter.com is a great tool for converting human readable time into epoch. So check that out if you're working with the API a lot. So that's the start and end parameters. The last thing is the data columns. There's a lot of these for the performance and resource endpoints, but with the error endpoint, there's only really 5 things that you'll be able to put into the data columns: error count, error time, line number, error message, and error constructor. So you'll notice we've been building the request JSON over here. We'll actually be able to, this is actually going to be a valid request that we'll send to the API here in just a second. We'll show you what the response looks like. But you may be wondering, what is the error constructor? Well, this is just the type of JavaScript or other error. So this could be a syntax error or a type error. It could also be an XHR error or a CSP violation. So that's what we mean by error constructor. Now, you'll notice the asterisks here. Coming up in a minute, I'll show you all of the available filtering options and parameters. And one of those is going to be hits. And if you set that to true, you'll be able to get individual rows of data instead of seeing the data grouped together. I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. So let's shoot this request off to the API and see what we get in the response. So we have our site specified, our start and end times. This is just 1 day here, and our data columns, we're just going to look for the error count. And so this is what the response looks like. Very straightforward. We have some metadata up here, and ultimately it's going to show us how many errors occurred during this 1 day time period. Cool. Now, what kind of optional parameters are available? So additional ways to filter and group the data. So there's really a lot of these. Like I mentioned, the hits parameter, if you set it to true, you'll get individual rows of data instead of seeing the data grouped together. By default, it's going to be false, so you'll get that grouped data. But some of these things are like page name and page group. These are basically all of the filter options in the Blue Triangle portal. And there's many more of these. Things like data type is an important one. You can choose RUM or synthetic data. So instead of studying these, we're just going to start with, what questions do we want to ask and what kind of data do we want to pull, and we'll skim through these and figure out which of the ones we're going to use. So those are the optional parameters. What are the group by options? So the group by options, this is all the possible ways to group the data. So if you think about it like an SQL query, this is going to be what you put in your group by clause. So you can group by time, you can group by traffic segment or country, you can group by browser, and the list goes on here. So one of the examples that I think is pretty common is, show me the error count by device. How many errors are happening by device? And as a matter of fact, that's going to be our first question we're going to answer here. How many errors are happening by device on my site? So let's look at what the request JSON looks like for that question. So in all these examples here, I'm just going to be using 1 day. I'm going to be using that same time period. If you're curious, that's what it is. It's just the period of 1 day. Now we have our required parameters: site, start, end, and data columns. So what we want to choose with the data columns, we just want to know how many errors are happening. So that's going to be error count. And by device, that we're going to be grouping that by device, right? So you can just add the group parameter here and enter device. The group and the data columns, these are both going to be arrays. In this case, there's just one element in the array, but this is pretty straightforward. This is what that request is going to look like. And here's the response. We have our metadata up top, and then in the data key, we have an array of the data. So we have mobile, the count for mobile, desktop, and tablet. So let's look at another example. How about which pages are producing the most errors? So I kind of threw you a curveball on this one. There's going to be a few things we'll need to know first. We'll need to be able to format the response. So one of the things we're going to do is sort by, to answer the question, which is which pages are producing the most errors, we're going to want to sort the results by error count descending, right? We want to see the highest number of errors at the top. And we're going to be grouping by page. So we're going to see the page and the error count, and we want to see the page with the highest number of errors. All right. So we're going to be using the order parameter and the sort parameter. And we'll probably use the limit parameter as well. We only want to see the top several items. We're not going to care about anything over, 25 or 50 pages down. Okay, so what does this look like? We're going to start with, as always, with our required parameters. The data column here, it's just going to be error count. You don't need to, if you're going to be grouping by something, you don't need to also specify that in the data columns. That can be you may be tempted to specify page name in the data columns, because data columns are really what you put in the select clause of an SQL query. So it might make sense for you to do that, but you don't need to do that if you're going to be grouping by that particular parameter. So we're going to say error count, and we're going to group by page name, right? So that's going to give us the data looking like this: page name and error count. But we want to see which pages are producing the most errors. So we're going to order that by error count, and we're going to sort by the error count descending. And we're going to say limit the results to just the top 50 items, or the top 50 pages in this case. So that's what this request is asking, and here's the top three results of the response. It looks like our PDP page is producing the most errors on this particular day, with a little over 7,500. All right, so the last question we have today we're going to answer is, what's the most common error on my site? We're going to need to do something a little different this one, because we want to see the error message, right? So we're going to want to do some of the same sorting and ordering. We'll probably order by error count and sort descending, just like we did with the last one. But we're going to need to do something a little different. I'll show you that right now. All right, so we have our required parameters here, the site, the start and end, as always. And then with the data columns, we're going to add the error count, and we're also going to add the error message. Now, if you remember toward the beginning of the training, I mentioned the hits parameter is required to see the error message data column. And that just means we're not going to be grouping the data the same way. So we're going to specify the hits parameter. We're going to set that to true. If you're wondering why it's called hits, it comes from the idea of a page hit. So this would be like one row of data, for example. So that's kind of the idea there. Is it's a page hit, and a page hit is going to have one or more errors. So we have our data columns error count and error message, and then we're going to group by the error message because we want to see how many times this particular error message is happening. What is the most common error message on the site? That's essentially what we're asking. So we're going to pull the error count, we're going to pull the error message, and we're going to group it by the error message. Right now we have the hit specified. So then all we got to do is order it by the error count and sort descending. So we see the highest number of errors, the error message with the highest number of errors at the top. And just to reduce the amount of detail in the response, we're just going to limit it to the top result. So we're just going to see, what's the most common error on the site. All right, and so if we send that off to the API, this is what the response looks like. One thing you'll notice when you set hits to true, you'll get additional data fields in here. But ultimately what we're interested in is this error message, which to answer our question, what's the most common error on the site? This error message is a type error, unable to get property offset, height of undefined or null reference at anonymous function. And you can see the URL and the line number where this error happened. But you can see what kind of error it was. It was a JavaScript error. The error constructor, it was a type error, and this happened 84 times on our site over this one day. Here's the file name and the line number as well. All right, so thank you everyone for your time today. That's all the information I had to share with you today. So now I'm going to pause for a second and check the chat and the questions and see if there's anything that I can help answer for you guys. All right, so we had a question about the site event markers earlier on. So I just wanted to explain that again quickly. I'm going to pull up an example here of what those site event markers look like. So I just moved into the Blue Triangle portal. We're on the Real User Performance Detail page right now. And you'll notice this button up here in the top left, event markers. I'm looking at the global ones right now. But basically, event markers are these lines, these annotations on the graph that, and they just mark significant events, browser updates. For example, this one right here was the SpaceX launch in the end of May. So we'll see a traffic dip around that time. But the site event marker API allows you to, if you have a deployment schedule, you're able to, maybe put that into your automation in the deployment to create these things in the graphs for you. All right. There's one more thing I wanted to show you before we move on, and that is there's a great feature in Blue Triangle where you're able to see the API JSON for the graphs and tables in the portal. So if you're in a graph, you're looking at a graph in the portal and you see this hamburger menu, you're able to click this. And if you go down, there's a view JSON for API option. And so if you click that, it'll show you what endpoint this request should go to. And it shows you the full JSON that generates the data for that particular graph. So really, really helpful tool. I probably should have mentioned that earlier on, but this is also great for helping you get started. If you're new to the API, you can just use examples that are already, built into Blue Triangle, and you can play around with the data there. All right, we had another question. How do you exclude certain errors in the error message? Sure. So there isn't a clear way to do that with the current configuration we have now. One thing you can do is do a little bit of post processing on the results of the API. If you're handling the request programmatically, it might be something that you could do in the post processing, but there isn't a parameter that allows you to exclude certain errors in the error message right now. And yes, I can definitely send out these slides. I'll send them out to you guys right after we're done here. And a reminder, you will get a replay of this right after we're done here as well. All right, so I think that's all we had for you guys today. Thank you so much for your time. If you do have any more questions for us, we're happy to speak with you offline. So feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can reach us here in support@bluetriangle.com. And for more information about our product trainings, like how to register for upcoming sessions or how to watch previous sessions, be sure to check out our Help Center. Again, that's help.bluetriangle.com. And when you're there, just click the big button for product training. All right, guys, thanks again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.